In today's video, I'm making patterns out of plywood. It wasn't what I set out to do and happened by accident. I put together a simple jig that I was going to use for a new Yosegi pattern. I tested the jig with plywood and the plywood pieces look very interesting, so instead of making Yosegi, I've been playing around with those. I'm not going to remake it, but I'll show you what I've done. It's very simple. It's just two pieces of plywood. I've put a 15-degree bevel on both pieces, this one on the top and this one underneath. I did that just by running it along the fence on the table saw. And this one doesn't even need the bevel on. You could cut it off straight there, but the screws, when you fix them together, will be getting a bit close to the table saw blade, so that's why I hung it over the edge there. And then next I got a scrap piece of pine studding. I put a 15-degree bevel on the top of that too and just screwed it all together, and then the piece that came off that, I slotted it in here. It's not really necessary, but I had it, so I fixed that in there as well. With the bed of the jig at 15 degrees and the angle of the blade set at 45, we've got a 30-degree difference, so when I make that cut, I end up with a very accurate 30-degree cut all the way through. When I put it together, it wasn't quite 15 degrees, so I had to put a shim in under here. If I hadn't have nailed it together, which is how I constructed it and then put screws in afterwards, I could have just pushed this block along to open it up, but I just gently prised that up and put the shim in, and then I put screws in from underneath. The angle of the bed hasn't got to be that precise, but because I was too short and the blade wouldn't go over anymore, I couldn't make any adjustment for that. But if you're too steep, then you can always angle the blade back this way, and as long as you've got 30 degrees between the two, then that's what you need. Then I cut and attached a piece of hardwood for a runner. I just did that with a couple of screws, and I made sure that it was a really good fit and there's no play in there whatsoever. And the last thing I did was add a strip of plywood along this edge here, and that's for a fence to hold the workpiece up against. I tried to put it together as square as I could using the fence of the table saw, but even so I still had to make adjustments, and I did that by drilling the holes out wider on the fence for the jig, and that gave me a bit of wiggle room. I then made test cuts, and with trial and error I got it just in the right position. Hopefully I explained that well enough, so let's make some cuts and try it out. And the first thing I need to do is set up a stop, and my stop is on the opposite side of my featherboard. And the plywood I'm using is 12mm construction ply. It's nothing fancy. It's what I have left over from other projects. It's what I used to do the tests with, and I'm going to use it for the rest of the pieces. After cutting a few, use calipers to check that they're accurate and make any adjustments to the jig. Also hold 3 of them together and check that the angles all fit together and make adjustments for that too. I'm looking pretty good here, so I'm going to cut a bunch more. The workpiece needs to be held down flat against the bed, else it won't be accurate, and I have got my fingers close to the blade. If you do this, then be very aware of where your blade is, and to help with it I did make this hold down tool, especially as the workpiece starts to get shorter. It's just a piece of plywood and a couple of blocks. I often do projects on the table saw with lots of repetitive cuts. That's when accidents can occur. You only need to switch off for a second, so make sure you're working safely. This is one of the reasons I bought this new saw stop with its built-in safety features. That's a good amount cut. Next I'm going to cut some smaller pieces. I'm making those from the same 12mm plywood by adjusting the stop by a few millimeters. When I cut one of the pieces off, it doesn't completely remove the first bevel, so I need to trim that down before cutting off the next piece. Here's the two different sized pieces side by side for comparison. The tiles made from the smaller ones will be glued together to make coasters. The tiles from the bigger pieces aren't big enough on their own, and glued together they would have been too big. I also cut a few hardwood pieces just to experiment with and to add some contrast. Now it's time to glue the pieces together, and if they're accurate, they should go together easily. This method of gluing went very well, and it also went very fast too. I applied glue to both sides of every joint and also put plenty on. This should help fill any voids or gaps, even though there weren't too many of those, as they fitted together extremely well. To clamp them, I'm using rubber bands. They're putting even pressure on all the pieces and pretty well line them all up automatically. When the glue sets, the blanks will be sliced into tiles ready for use in different projects. At the end of the video, I'll make a few items from the tiles just to give a few examples of how they can be used. I need some half tiles, so I use baking paper in the middle. I still clamp the two halves together as the rubber bands do such a great job of aligning all the pieces. I also need some single triangle pieces, so here I glue 3 of those along with a half tile blank. Next, I need to pull the rubber bands off and split the ones with the paper, which wasn't as easy as I expected until I figured out a good method. They weren't going to come apart without a little help from a mallet, and even hitting them in my hand didn't work, but against the side of the workbench they popped right apart. I should get a fair few slices from those, and I also glue together the contrasting ones. They need a little sanding, not too much, just to clean up any glue squeeze out along the seams. I could have done this on the disc or belt sander, but it would have been easy to go too far and change the shape of the blocks, so sanding them by hand is a much safer method. The blanks could be sliced into tiles on the miter saw or table saw, but I'm using the band saw as there's less waste. I tried to sand them all together and I could have managed, but I found a better way of doing it. I used the 40 grit disc on an orbital sander and that made pretty light work of it. I'll sand them to a higher finish a bit later, but first I'll cut some thin cedar strips to edge and finish around the outsides. I'm gluing two opposite edges at a time, and then when the glue's dry, I'll sand the ends of those flush and then I can glue the next two edges on. This hard wax oil from Whittle Waxes has become my usual finish lately. I put two coats on with a light sand between. I reckon the coasters came out pretty nice. Next I'll attempt to make a bowl and I'll start that by cutting some thicker slices. It's going to be a very shallow bowl so the pattern stays pretty much as it is and doesn't get too distorted as it would with a deeper bowl. The outside needs trim as it would look pretty ugly without. For that, I'm using a piece of camphor laurel. I did think of using a contrasting darker wood, but I wanted to keep it subtle and allow the pattern to shine. I'm just fine tuning the fit with a little sanding here and there. I'm holding the joint down firmly without rocking it and putting slightly more pressure on the side that needs adjusting. While the glue was setting, I played around with the contrasting pieces that I glued up earlier. After slicing a few pieces, I glued together a strip. It came out pretty cool when sanded, and it would look great inlaid into a project. And a thicker slice makes an easy Christmas tree decoration. I also tried putting veneers between the triangle pieces, and I did that by gluing veneers to two sides of the block before slicing them up, and I left the other side clear, and then I put one side of the veneer to the outside and just glued them around like so. And something else I experimented with was this small box. This was before I made the video from the original pieces. All I did was cut a slice off for the top, and then I drilled this centre out with a Forstner bit. I glued in a round piece underneath, and then I glued in a key and cut a piece away, and that's pretty much all it is. I'm not particularly fond of the outside of it, and I think I'd veneer that if I was to make it again, and I may even veneer the top and the underneath, do that with hardwood as well, possibly, but there's another example what you could do with it. Back to the bowl, and here I'm gluing on a block so I can mount it to the lathe. And I almost forgot to cut the corners off first. I could have turned them down, but it's easier to do that on the bandsaw. I'm turning the underneath first and starting with a dovetailed mortise so I can reverse the bowl afterwards to turn the opposite side. Plywood really isn't easy to turn. You won't get a perfect finish, but with sharp tools you can get it decent and then finish it with quite a bit of sanding. I reckon the pattern's pretty cool considering it's made from cheap construction grade plywood, but you could use any plywood. It was an experimental project with lots of possibilities. I plan on using it on a tabletop. I think that would look really cool. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.